Colonel Caen, Colorado, of the 116th, moved out of Ville around 12 p.m. to set up his headquarters at the pre-arranged command post location, the Chateau Diesel, a half-kilometre south of the village. In the process, his headquarters group, 3 or 4 officers and a couple of enlisted men, got isolated behind a hedge just short of the chateau. Private Carl West, with a platoon of rangers, arrived on the scene. Caen spotted the men and ordered them to act as his command post guard. The chateau was full of Germans. A German riding a bicycle came up the road, and the rangers shot him. They then took up outpost positions around the chateau. The rangers watched as a platoon of German soldiers emerged from the chateau and formed up in a column around an old 2-wheeled horse buggy with wounded in it. The Germans were unaware of the Americans' presence, with their rifles slung over their shoulders. They were pulling the cart along, with 2 men shoving and 2 pulling. The rangers waited until the Germans got within about 10 yards, then stepped out onto the road with their weapons pointed at them. The Germans surrendered immediately. With 25 prisoners, what do you do? The rangers put them in an orchard, assigned 1 man to guard them, and attempted to interrogate them. To their surprise, there were no Germans among the prisoners, only Hungarians, Romanians, and Russians. There was 1 German non-com, a middle-aged man who seemed more relieved than concerned about the war. He was anxious about a German counterattack, but not nearly as concerned as the rangers were. The situation was becoming very tenuous. Colonel Caen had 1,500 yards of front to cover with only about 35 men, expecting a German armoured attack. As the afternoon wore on, there was talk among the rangers about shooting the prisoners. However, it was pointed out that this was not only illegal and immoral, but also impractical. When the light began to fade, the prisoners were made to lie close to each other. A man with a bar, Browning automatic rifle, was placed at the end of the group, with the understanding that if anyone made a move, the whole group would be dealt with. The prisoners lay still through the night, and it was a very quiet night indeed. At 2 p.m., Lieutenant J.M. Fye of the Rangers was on the outskirts of Ville. He lost a man who had been crossing a gap in a hedge to a German sniper. Just then, a ranger came down the road with 8 German prisoners of war. Fye lined the prisoners up in the gap with their hands clasped over their helmets, then had his men pass the gap behind the prisoners. With no time to deal with them further, he waved the Germans on to find someone to whom they could surrender. Colonel Caen's isolation was complete. His only working radio belonged to the liaison officer from the 743rd Tank Battalion, who could not contact any of the tanks still on the beach. Caen did receive some help that might not have been needed from the Navy. At 1:50 p.m., a signalman on LCI 538 at Dog Green Beach sent a visual message to Destroyer Harding, claiming that the church steeple was an enemy artillery observation post. Harding replied, "Which church? Ville? Don't you mean the church at Seville?" "No, Ville," Harding was told. Harding then called the commander of Force O forward observers to report the request. The chief fire officer authorized the fire order 5 minutes later, permitting the destruction of the church for 1 minute. At 2:13 p.m., Harding opened fire from a range of 3,200 yards and completely demolished the church, expending 40 rounds, all of which landed on the target. This incident was typical of not only D-Day, but also the later fighting in France. Whenever the Americans faced artillery fire, they often believed that the Germans were using church spires as observation posts and used their own artillery to knock those spires down. Sometimes they were right, often they were wrong. In any case, few standing spires remained in Normandy after the battle. In Ville, the town was in American hands, unknown to LCI 538 and Harding. None of those on the spot thought the spire was being used as an OP, observation post. Harding claimed a ranger officer later confirmed that the church contained 4 enemy machine guns, which were completely demolished. Harding's claim that every shell hit the church was contradicted by Mayor Michel Hardel of Ville, who stated that the first shell exploded in his house, causing the collapse of the second-floor wall. The second hit the bakery, killing the baker and his baby. The following shells hit surrounding buildings as well as the church. The GIs in the town took some casualties from the naval fire. Such contradictions in eyewitness testimony are common in war, exacerbated by the nature of the action. Small groups without knowledge of the overall situation, no radio or other contact, each group engaged in its own battle. When American destroyers had a spotter, they could be deadly accurate. Private Slaughter of the 116th observed Sergeant William Presley leading a small band of men. Presley, 6'4" and weighing 230 pounds, was the epitome of a first sergeant, rugged-looking, immaculate, and gifted with a booming voice. In front of Presley lay a naval forward observer, dead with a radio strapped to his back. Presley had been observing a battery of Nebelwerfer 105 mortars firing from a fixed position a couple of 100 metres ahead. The shells were causing havoc with reinforcements arriving on the beach. Presley retrieved the radio, made contact with the artillery, and provided coordinates. The artillery fired, and with further corrections from Presley, a final fire for effect order was given. Slaughter recalled hearing the salvo boom and the ground trembling as the shells saturated the area, some landing too close for comfort. The Nebelwerfer battery was put out of action, and Presley earned the Distinguished Service Cross. Shortly thereafter, Slaughter saw his first German prisoner being interrogated by a German-speaking American officer armed with a carbine. The captive was on his knees, hands behind his head. The American demanded to know where the minefields were located. The prisoner repeatedly gave his name, rank, and serial number. The American, with an arrogant look, fired his carbine between the German's knees. The German pointed to his crotch, then his head, indicating that the information was not to be revealed. The American interrogator gave up and waved the prisoner away. Slaughter commented that this convinced him they were fighting first-rate soldiers. At nightfall, the Ville area was the weakest part of the beachhead. The Army official history states that the 5th Rangers and elements of the 1st Battalion, 116th, with some combat engineers, were holding defensive positions west and southwest of the village. Many were surrounded. One Ranger platoon had managed to reach Point 2 Hawk almost without incident. Communication ranged from poor to completely absent. The Ville draw remained closed almost until dark. Dog green, white and red sectors on the beach were still under heavy artillery fire, and few landings had been attempted after 12 p.m., meaning that few reinforcements were arriving. Lieutenant Francis Dawson of the Rangers, who had already earned a Distinguished Service Cross for getting men off the beach, was stopped on the west side of Ville by machine gun fire. They failed to eliminate this gun, withdrew, and attempted to outflank it. As night fell, they were not far from Ville, so they dug in. Others had similar experiences. Lieutenant Murphy got through Ville in the mid-afternoon, but then stopped. The right flank was the English Channel, and the left flank was their own outposts. They held this position for the rest of D-Day, less than a mile from where they had landed. Private Paul Calvat of the 116th described his company's route to Ville and declared that by the end of the day, the group was completely fatigued, demoralized, disorganized, and utterly incapable of concerted military action. The men were scattered from captured German positions overlooking the Ville draw to the designated command post with Colonel Canam. However, the Germans in Ville were also fatigued, demoralized, disorganized, and incapable of concerted action. From behind their hedgerows, German snipers and machine gunners could delay, harass, and stop the American advance, but they could not push the Rangers and the 116th back down the bluff. The village of Ville had not been defended by the Germans, but Sloron held a company of infantry from the 3,152nd Division. The Germans were dug in on the high ground commanding the upper end of the Les Moulins draw, controlling both sides of the road coming up the draw and the approaches to the main crossroad on the western outskirts of the village. Major Sidney Bingham of Colorado's 2nd Battalion, 116th, organized a series of attacks against the German position, only to be stopped by machine gun fire from positions that his men were unable to locate. In the afternoon, the GIs at Sloron received help from the 115th Regiment, 29th Division. The 115th landed at E1 draw just before noon, but it took many hours for the regiment to clear the beach and launch an assault on Sloron from the northeast. They were slowed by mines and by a rumour that American mine detectors could not locate German mines, making the paths marked by white tape unsafe. German snipers on the bluff caused casualties and delays. Sergeant Charles Zephas recalled that Sloron was only about a kilometre from the beach, but the 2nd Battalion 115th did not start its attack until late afternoon, and the 1st Battalion did not reach its objective south of Sloron until 6 p.m. Private John Hooper approached Sloron in mid-afternoon. While cautiously advancing, he tripped a bouncing Betty mine, which popped into the air but fell back to the ground as a dud. Fatigued, he lay there, wondering if the war would last much longer. Hooper got up and continued, only to be held up by machine gun fire from a wood. A prolonged firefight ensued, and rifle ammunition for the GIs was critically low. A lieutenant with an M1 rifle and binoculars told Hooper to cover him as he intended to climb a tree and shoot the enemy. Hooper advised against it, but the lieutenant climbed the tree, found a good firing position, and shot 3 times before falling and screaming, "My God, I'm hit!" Hooper and a buddy dragged him to a hedge. The lieutenant had been shot in the chest and was given morphine by a medic. Hooper commented on the waste of commissioning such a lieutenant who tried to act like Sergeant York but didn't last a day. The lieutenant died that evening. By late afternoon, E1 was open for tracked vehicles. At 8 p.m, Major Bingham sent a runner to request tank support for the assault on Slauson. 3 tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion came up, destroying sniper and machine gun nests in the village's vicinity. Just as the infantry began to move in, 5-inch shells from American destroyers began pouring down. As at Ville, the troops at Sloron had no way of contacting the Navy and suffered some casualties from the bombardment. After the naval fire was lifted, the fighting in Sloron reached a crescendo. GIs ducked around corners, threw grenades into windows, kicked in doors, and sprayed interiors with their bars and carbines. The Germans, taking advantage of the stone houses that were almost like fortresses, fought back furiously. In the midst of this street fighting, several men from the 115th were startled to see Lieutenant Colonel William Warfield calmly sitting on a curb, tossing pebbles at a scruffy dog. Another strange sight was General Gart, who had come ashore in the late afternoon and set up the 29th Division headquarters in a quarry in the Ville draw. He could not get much information about the situation on top, but could see a long line of men trudging up the draw. In the draw, he spotted a passing soldier eating an orange. When the man tossed the orange peel away, Gart sprang up from the maps he was studying and gave the GI a furious tongue-lashing for littering. By nightfall, the 29th Division troops held positions north, east and south of Slaon and parts of the town. Elements from 5 battalions had spent the afternoon fighting through an area of about a square mile without securing it. The area was defended by only a single German company, which spoke well for the German defenders, and showed how effective defensive positions, hedgerows and stone houses on narrow streets, could be. It also demonstrated how difficult it was in World War II for infantry lacking on-site artillery, tanks or mortar support to carry out a successful assault. Although the Germans had done well and the Americans had failed to reach their objectives, the prospects for the next day were decidedly dismal for the Germans. The GIs had fresh supplies coming up from the beach, plus reinforcements and all those vehicles waiting for a chance to drive up the draw and get into the action. The Germans were all but surrounded, with no hope of fresh supplies or reinforcements, and were badly outnumbered. In Seville and the other 2 villages, small separate battles developed throughout the afternoon. Advancing American units were more or less blind, and coordinated action by the assaulting forces was impossible. Captain Joe Dawson got his men from G Company, 16th Regiment, 1st Division, into the western edge of Seville in the afternoon. However, after seizing the first few buildings, he was unable to advance further due to a terrible experience. The Navy had been given orders to fire on Seville as soon as visibility permitted. Dawson explained that due to the haze of battle, which permeated the whole sky and area, observation was almost impossible. Nevertheless, in the late afternoon, the Navy did go ahead and decided to level Seville. While we were there, we lost 64 men from our naval fire as it swept the town from one end to the other. That was the worst tragedy that befell us on D-Day. Harding participated in the bombardment. The ship's action report read, "At 6:54 p.m., received orders from Commander Task Force to open fire for 2 minutes on Seville Church, range 3,500 yards, which was complied with. At 6:57 p.m., ceased fire. Church badly battered, 73 rounds expended. At 7:35 p.m., again received orders from Commander Task Force to open fire for 2 minutes on Seville Church and to spread fire around the area. At 7:37 p.m., opened fire again on the same target, range 3,800 yards, scoring numerous hits on the church and area, 60 rounds expended. It is believed that this church was being used as an observation post for mortifiers, since the beach at this time was being bombarded apparently from inland. The CTF was just guessing. Dawson's losses and those of other companies in Seville and Slaon to so-called friendly fire were one of the prices paid for the complete absence of radio communication between those on the high ground and the Navy in the Channel. Between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m., the 18th Regiment landed in front of El Dror and began moving up to join the attack on the Seville area. The 2nd Battalion passed to the west of Dawson to take up positions a half-kilometre south-northeast of the village. The 1st Battalion ran into 2 platoons of Germans holding trenches near the head of El Dror, eventually bypassing them and heading toward the village. As we moved against moderate fire toward the town of Colleville, Lieutenant Charles Ryan of Company A related, "I became aware of a small group of men moving steadily toward Seville. As I reached my position, I saw that it was my battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert York, who was one of the greatest combat leaders of WW2 or any other war. He had his command group with him. He paused to say, 'Keep moving, boys, through town to the other side. We're getting a handle on this thing, but we still have a long way to go.' Then he moved ahead." At 5:30 p.m., Ryan's platoon reached the coastal road where it assumed defensive positions for the anticipated counterattack that night. Ryan remembered, "We were subjected to continuous machine gun and rifle fire." He paused and then continued, "But there was a beachhead. The 1st Division was ashore. The 6th of June 1944 was an exhausting day, a frightening day, an exhilarating day, a sorrowful day, and a joyous day. It was a day when the men in the 1st Division lived up to the division motto, 'No mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first.' Now, 45 years later, it's hard for me to believe that I was a part of this. I still correspond with some of the men in my D-Day unit, and we're all still proud of what was done and happy that we were a part of it, and completely bewildered as to why we survived. But we're bewildered by lots of things these days." At 7 p.m., the 1st Division CEO, General Hubner, landed on Easy Red and set up his command post. At 8:30 p.m., General Guerreau and the advance headquarters of the 5th Corps left the Anong for the high ground inland. The men of the 29th and 1st Divisions were scattered and isolated in 18 different pockets around the 3 villages. There was no continuous line. They had no artillery or heavy mortars, only a few tanks, and no communications with the naval or air forces. For the night they were on the defensive, dug in, but they were there. The presence of so much brass on the beach was proof that they had secured the beachhead and won the battle. The German defenders had inflicted very heavy casualties on the assaulting force at Omaha Beach. The 5th Corps suffered 2,400 dead, wounded and missing out of 34,000 troops of the 55,000-man assault force ashore. Losses of 7.2% in one day were horrendous, but that was 5 percentage points less than anticipated. The 352nd Division suffered 1,200 killed, wounded and missing, or about 20% of its total strength. The 29th and 1st Divisions had accomplished their basic objective, establishing a foothold, even if they had not driven anywhere near as far inland as they had planned or hoped. The 352nd Division had not accomplished its objective of stopping the assault on the beach. The experiences of Private Franz Gall of the 352 provide some vivid images of what the day was like for a German infantryman. At 8:30 a.m. he had thought the battle was won, but the Americans continued to land to his left and right. American squads and platoons had bypassed Widerstand's Nest 62 and attacked it from the rear, making it necessary for the Germans to defend themselves from attacks from behind. At noon he got a half ration of bread and a mess tin of milk, but no supplies or reinforcements came in. A runner sent to get help was never seen again. The Americans pressed on, and the resistance became weaker. Gall was shot through the left hand. The medic who put a bandage on smiled and said it looked like a good hiatus $1 million wound. American troops got into the network of trenches and were suddenly only 20 meters away. Gall grabbed his rifle and ran towards Civil. On the outskirts, he linked up with his company CO and the few survivors from Widerstand's Nest 62. The Americans were already in the village. The CO ordered Gall and 15 other wounded men into a truck for transport to a hospital in Bayeux. The route was blocked. Ruins and rubble covered the crossroads. Here was the payoff from the B-7S and battleship bombardment. Dead cattle lay in the pastures, and the supply units had also suffered their share of casualties. Many of them were immobilized. Gall's truck came under fire from a strafing RAF fighter plane. He and his comrades jumped out. Those with light wounds proceeded on foot toward Bayeux. En route, they commandeered a French farmer's horse and wagon. In Bayeux, they found that the hospital had been evacuated. They were told to proceed to 6th, where they found the city badly damaged and still burning from air bombardment. They spent the night in a farmhouse drinking Calvados. Of the 20 men from Widerstand's Nest 62, only 3 escaped unwounded and were taken prisoner. Gall concluded, "None of my comrades who had survived the invasion continued to believe in victory." The German failure at Omaha Beach had many causes. The attempt to defend everywhere had scattered the division in driblets here, driblets there. Furthermore, the CO of the 352nd, General CCE, completely misinterpreted Allied intentions. At 2 a.m., when he received reports about paratroopers landing on his left flank between St. Lo and Carentan, he thought the Americans were trying to separate the 352nd from the 79th. At 3:10 a.m., he ordered his division reserve, called C Gruppe Mée after the CO of the 95th Regiment, to move from its positions south of Bayeux all the way to the Via Este, but it was a wild goose chase. The paratroopers were a handful of 100 men who had been misdropped. At 5:50 a.m., C realized his error and told MEA to halt the camp group and await further orders. Within a half hour, the Americans began landing at Omaha, but not until 7:35 a.m. did CCE commit reserves to the area, and then he sent only 1 battalion from the camp group. At 8:35 a.m., he sent the other 2 battalions against the British 50th Division at Gold Beach. Splitting the 95th in this fashion meant it was now unable to strike a telling blow. The battalions were also hours late in arriving at the battle areas because, as they moved, they were shot up by Allied fighters and hit by Allied bombers. Inadequate intelligence in many cases, and none at all in others, badly hampered CCE. But he was as guilty of passing on bad information as he was a victim of receiving it. At 10 a.m., he reported penetrations in the forward positions of the 352nd at Omaha, but indicated that they were not dangerous. At 1:35 p.m., he advised 7th Army Headquarters that the American assault had been hurled back into the sea, except at Seville, which he said was being counterattacked by the 95th. Not until 6 p.m. did he admit that the Americans had infiltrated through the 352nd strongpoints. But even then he claimed that only Seville was in danger. At 5 p.m., Field Marshal Rundstedt demanded that the Allied bridgehead be wiped out that evening. A few minutes later, General Jodl sent out an order from OKW that all available forces should be thrown into the battle. At 6:25 p.m., CCE ordered his last uncommitted unit, the Engineer Battalion, to move to Slaon and fight as infantry. By the time the engineers got there, it was dark, too late to do anything but dig in and wait for daylight. Shortly before midnight on June 6th, CCE admitted to his Corps Command Commander, General Marks, that the 352nd desperately needed help. Tomorrow the division will be able to offer the enemy the same determined resistance it did today, but because of heavy casualties, reinforcements must be brought up by the day after tomorrow. Losses of men and material in the resistance nests were total. Marks replied, "All reserves available to me have already been moved up. Every inch of the ground must be defended to the utmost capacity until new reinforcements can be brought up." In summary, the fighting power of the 352nd had been frittered away in stubborn defensive action by small groups who were able to delay but not stop the American advance. Rundstedt's insistence on close-up defense of the beach had made the initial assault phase harder for the Americans, but at excessive cost for the Germans, and it had not worked in that respect. The Army's official history states that 5th Corps had surmounted a severe crisis, and that the success of its hard fight should be measured in other terms than the size of the beachhead. The 352nd was used up, and no reinforcements were immediately available. Those coming to the sound of the guns from the interior of France, whether infantry or panzer, were going to have to run a gauntlet of air and naval gunfire to get there. The Atlantic Wall had been cracked at Omaha Beach, and there was nothing behind it in the way of fixed fortifications except those awful hedgerows. How did 5th Corps do it? The sheer weight of the assault was one of the deciding factors, but by itself it was not enough to ensure victory. Private Carl Wyss of the Rangers has an answer to the question in his oral history. He was relating a story about his company commander, Captain George Whittington. "He was a hell of a man," Wyss said. "He led people. I recall the time a week or so after D-Day when we shot a cow and cut off some beef and were cooking it over a fire on sticks. Captain Whittington came up and threw a German boot next to the fire and said, 'I'll bet some son of a bitch misses that.' We looked at the boot. The German's leg was still inside it. I'll bet by God he did miss it." That same day, Wyss heard the executive officer of the 5th Ranger Battalion, Major Richard Sullivan, criticising Captain Whittington for unnecessarily exposing himself. Whittington said to Sully, "You saw it happen back on that goddamn beach. Now you tell me how the hell you lead men from behind." Wyss's introduction to combat came on D-Day. He fought with the Rangers through the next 11 months. He concluded that the Allied High Command had been right to insist that there be practically no experienced troops in the initial waves that hit that beach, because an experienced infantryman is a terrified infantryman. They wanted guys like me who were more amazed than they were frozen with fear. Because the longer you fight a war, the more you figure your numbers coming up tomorrow, and it really gets to be god-awful. Wyss made a final point. In war, the best rank is either private or colonel or better, but those ranks in between, hey, those people have got to be leaders. At Omaha Beach, by early afternoon, a majority of the German pillboxes on the beach and bluff had been put out of action by destroyers, tanks and infantry, suppressing if not entirely eliminating machine gun fire. Sniper fire, however, continued. The Germans made use of the maze of communication trenches and tunnels to occupy positions earlier abandoned and resumed firing. Worse, artillery from inland and flank positions kept harassing fire on the beach. Some of it was haphazard, some called in by ops on the bluff. Even the haphazard fire was effective because the traffic jam remained. It was hardly possible for a shell or mortar to miss its target. Fired on the beach, flat to miss Captain Oscar Rich, was a spotter for the 5th Field Artillery Battalion. He was on an LCT with his disassembled L5 plane and arrived at Easy Red at 1 p.m. "I'd like to give you first my impression of the beach, say from 100 yards out till the time we got on the beach," he said. Looking in both directions, you could see trucks burning, tanks burning, piles of, I don't know what, burning. Ammunition had been unloaded on the beach. I saw one pile of 5-gallon gasoline cans, maybe 500 cans in all. A round hit them. The whole thing just exploded and burned. I've never seen so much pure chaos in my life. But what I expected yet didn't see was anybody in hysterics. People on the beach were very calm. The CBs were directing traffic, bringing people in, and assigning them to areas, showing them which way to go. They were very matter-of-fact about the whole thing, directing traffic just like it was the 4th of July parade back home, rather than where we were. While the LCT circled offshore looking for a place to go in, a mortar round hit it in the bow. The skipper, an ensign, nevertheless saw a likely spot and moved in. The beachmaster waved him off. He had forgotten to drop his sea anchor. So they had one heck of a time trying to get off the sandbar, but finally they made it. Rich said, "I felt sorry for this ensign who was really shook up after taking this round in the bow and forgetting to drop his sea anchor. He asked me, 'Lieutenant, do you know anything about running ships?' I said, 'Hell, man, I've been running boats all my life. Actually, the biggest I'd ever run was a skiff fishing in the river. But he said, 'You want to run this?' And I said, 'I sure as hell do.' I got one of the sailors and told him, 'Son, you've got one job and one job only.' He said, 'What's that?' I said, 'When we get within 100 yards of the shore, you drop this sea anchor whether I tell you to or not.'" The LCT went in again. Somehow the sailors managed to drop the bow, even as the craft took another hit in the engine room. 2 jeeps ran off, and to Rich's dismay, they forgot to hook my airplane on, and I didn't have a jeep. A CB came over with a bulldozer, hooked a rope onto the tow bar for the L5, pulled it onto the beach, unhooked the plane, told Rich he had other work to do, wished him luck, and drove off. So there I was with an airplane, no mechanic, no help, and no transportation. Rich saw the beachmaster. He couldn't have been over 25 years old. He had a nice handlebar moustache, and he was sitting in a captain's chair there on the beach. He had a radio, 6 telephones, and a bunch of men serving him as runners. He was just keeping everything going. People came up to him and wanted to know this, that, or the other. He never lost his temper. He never got excited. He would just tell them and they'd go away. He was only a lieutenant, but these army colonels and generals would come up and demand this and demand that, and he'd say, "I'm sorry, I haven't got it. You'll just have to take what you've got and go on with it." They would shake their heads and go off and leave him. When he'd spot an open space, he'd say, "Let's get a craft in there. Let's get a boat in there. Let's get that one out of the way. Get a bulldozer over and shove that tank out of the way. Make room for somebody to come in here." He kept that beach moving. I have no idea who he was, but the Navy certainly should have been proud of him because he did a tremendous job. Rich told the beachmaster he needed a jeep to pull his L5 off the beach. The beachmaster said, "There's one over there. There's nobody in it. Go take it." Rich did, and wove his way through the congestion to the E1 draw with his plane in tow. Then he drove up the draw. Rich was possibly the first to do so. It had just opened. On top, Rich found the apple orchard outside Saint Laurent, where he was supposed to be, and began to assemble his plane. With no mechanic to help, he was not making much progress. From time to time, he would get some help from a GI who could not resist the temptation to tinker with a machine. Sooner or later, an officer would yell at the soldier to get the hell back to the battle, and Rich would be on his own again. Not until dark did he get his plane ready to fly. Rich was lucky. German artillery and mortar fire concentrated on the exits. Without spotter planes, the Navy could not locate the sources of the fire. As the afternoon wore on, the shelling got heavier. Admiral Charles Cook and Major General Tom Handy of the War Department, observing the action from the deck of Harding, decided they needed a closer look. They offloaded onto an LCI, crossed the beach, transferred to an LCM, and went in through a gap in the obstacles. The beach was strewn with wrecked landing craft, wrecked tanks, and various other vehicles. Cook recalled it was also strewn with dead and wounded. Handy went to the right, Cook to the left. Shells burst all around them, throwing sand in their faces, forcing them to hit the beach. In Cook's case, this inflicted some slight shrapnel wounds. After a couple of hours, they rejoined and decided to get out because, as Cook said, the shelling was getting very much heavier. increasing the casualty toll, and it appeared highly desirable to leave. Lieutenant Vince Schlotterbeck of the 5th ESB spent 7 hours on an LCT cruising just out of range of the German guns, waiting for an opportunity to go in. Like most others, the skipper had cut loose the barrage balloon. There were no German planes strafing the fleet, and the balloons gave the Germans a target to spot and zero in on. Schlotterbeck spent the time perched on top of the landing ramp, watching whatever caught his eye. The underwater obstacles could be seen plainly since the tide was not all the way in. The wreckage on the beach and in the water was greater than anything I had ever imagined. Tanks were strewn along the beach, some half submerged. We could see that there were only 2 or 3 tanks on which we could depend. At 6:30 p.m, the LCT tried to run in. We had a likely spot but ran onto a sandbar and had to back off because the water was too deep. Just as we cleared, a shell threw up a spray in the exact spot where we had been grounded. The skipper tried again. He found a gap in the obstacles, but a big ship loaded with ammunition was grounded and burning fiercely. The almost continuous explosions made it too dangerous to land there, so we sought another spot. Finally, the skipper saw a good spot at Fox Red and turned toward it, but an LCI raced him to the gap, cutting in front of the LCT and causing it to land on another sandbar. This time it was stuck. Our engines throbbed at top speed, and our craft seemed ready to disintegrate from vibration. The stern anchor had been dropped and was being pulled in, but instead of pulling us off, the anchor just dragged along in the sand. The engines screamed with power, never ceasing. Meanwhile, the LCI that had beaten the LCT to the gap had lowered its ramps, and men were wading into shore. Suddenly, a shell burst in their midst, and we never saw any of them again. Then the Germans sent a shell into the front of the craft, one in the middle and one in the rear. Schlotterbeck's LCT finally floated free on the rising tide. The officers on the craft held a conference to decide whether to wait until after midnight, when the tide would be full, or to continue to attempt to get ashore. Everyone was in favour of going in as soon as possible, because we did not like the idea of hitting the beach after dark. So we kept on trying, and at about 8 p.m. we found the right spot. Schlotterbeck went ashore. My mind had already been made up to the fact that a horrible sight would greet me, and it is a good thing that I had prepared myself because the number of casualties was appalling. The number of dead was very great, but what struck us hardest was the boys who had been wounded and were trying to hitch rides back to the transports. Wounded were walking along the beach trying to pick up a ride. Those who were more severely wounded came in pairs, supporting each other, when they rightfully should have been stretcher cases. Schlotterbeck had to walk on dead bodies to proceed up the bluff. At one point I was ready to walk on a body face up when the soldier slowly opened his eyes, and I almost twisted myself out of shape to avoid him. Luckily, I missed him. Private M.C. Mark of the 115th Regiment had his own unnerving experience on his LCVP going in that afternoon. He had, of all things, exchanged shoes with Corporal Terry. "We thought we got a better fit," Mark said. Going up the bluff, Terry was in front of Mark when he stepped on a mine. It split open his foot and shoe. As I walked by, Mark reported, I said, "So long, Terry. I still wonder if he made it to the hospital." As Mark climbed, a dozen German prisoners guarded by a GI descended. These were the first Germans we saw. They didn't look so tough. An American went down, hit by a sniper. The medic hurried over to treat the wounded man, but the sniper shot the medic in the arm. "Hey!" the medic shouted angrily. "You're not supposed to shoot medics!" Mark got to the top and moved forward with his squad to join the fight in Saint Laurent. Just as he arrived, naval gunfire came in. He got showered with bricks and mortar, but a helmet he had picked up on the beach protected him. The squad retreated and dug in beside a hedge. Down on the beach, men went about their work despite the shelling. The demolition teams were making progress in their vital task of clearing paths through the obstacles. As the tide dropped in the afternoon, they methodically blew up RL's Belgian gates and tetrahedra, ignoring sniper fire. They completed 3 gaps partially opened in the morning, made 4 new ones, and widened others. By evening, they had 13 gaps fully opened and marked, and had cleared about 1/3 of the obstacles on the beach. The engineers, meanwhile, were opening the exits for vehicles. This involved blowing the concrete anti-tank barriers, filling in the anti-tank ditch, removing mines, and laying wire mesh on the sand so the jeeps and trucks could get across. By 1 p.m, they had E1 open to traffic. Movement began at once, but within a couple of hours, new trouble loomed. The vehicles coming up on the plateau were unable to get inland because the crossroad at Saint-Laurent was still in enemy hands. For an hour or so, vehicles were jammed bumper to bumper all the way from the beach to the plateau. At 4 p.m, the engineers pushed a branch road south that bypassed the defended crossroad, and movement resumed. At 5 p.m, the Ville exit D1 was opened, further relieving the congestion on the beach. Tanks, trucks and jeeps made it to the top, but almost no artillery did. By dusk, elements of 5 artillery battalions had landed, but they had lost 26 guns to enemy fire and most of their equipment except for one mission fired by the 7th Field Artillery Battalion. American cannon, the queen of the battlefield, played no part in the battle on D-Day. The 2 anti-aircraft battalions scheduled to land never even got ashore. They had to wait for D+1. Over 50 tanks were lost either at sea or on the beach. Planners had scheduled 2,400 tons of supplies to reach Omaha Beach during D-Day, but only 100 tons got ashore. A large proportion of what did arrive was destroyed on the beach. Precious little got up to the plateau. Troops on top had to fight with what they carried up the bluff on their backs. They ran dangerously low on 3 critical items: ammunition, rations, and cigarettes. Some did not get resupplied until D+2. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc had to wait until June 9th for fresh supplies. Despite the shelling, the congestion, and the obstacles all through D-Day afternoon, landing craft kept coming in, bringing more tanks and infantry. Lieutenant Dean Well of the Navy, who had brought his LCT flotilla to Omaha Beach at H hour and landed the first tanks, made a return trip at 2 p.m. His experience was typical of the skippers trying to get ashore in the follow-up waves. "We cruised along the beach parallel for hundreds of yards," he recalled, looking for an opening through the obstacles. "One time we tried to nose our way through but made contact with one of the obstacles, which had a mine that detonated and blew a hole in our landing gear, which meant that we could not let our ramp down." Rockwell finally made it to shore, but the damage to his LCT prevented him from discharging his tanks and trailers. "We were able, however, to put the poor soldiers ashore. They were from a medical detachment," Rockwell said. "Let me say, I have never seen anybody who liked less to follow through on an assignment than they. The beach was literally covered with military personnel backed up, held down by the fire from the enemy. The enemy was bombarding the beach from mortars back over the bluff. The Germans had predetermined targets, and bodies and sand and material would fly when these mortars went off. Anyway, we put the poor soldiers ashore, and we felt very, very sorry for them. But we thanked God that we had decided to join the Navy instead of the Army." Ernest Hemingway, a correspondent for Collier's, came in on the 7th Wave in an LCVP commanded by Lieutenant Robert Anderson of Roanoke, Virginia. To Hemingway, the LCVP looked like a bathtub. He compared the LCT to a floating freight gondola. The LCIs, according to Hemingway, were the only amphibious operations craft that looked as though they were made to go to sea. They very nearly had the lines of a ship. The channel was covered with bathtubs, gondolas, and ships of all kinds, but very few of them were headed toward shore. They would start toward the beach, then sheer off and circle back. As Anderson's LCVP made its way toward shore, Texas was firing over it at the anti-tank barrier at one of the exits. "Those of our troops who were not wax-grey with seasickness," Hemingway wrote, "were watching the Texas with looks of surprise and happiness. Under the steel helmets they looked like pikemen of the Middle Ages, to whose aid in battle had suddenly come some strange and unbelievable monster. To Hemingway the big guns sounded as though they were throwing whole railway trains across the sky. Anderson had a hard time finding his designated landing area. Hemingway tried to help him navigate. They argued about landmarks. Once, Anderson tried to go in, only to receive intense fire. "Get her the hell around and out of here," Coxswain Anderson shouted. "Get her out of here!" The LCVP pulled back and circled. Hemingway could see infantry working up the bluff slowly, laboriously, as though they were Atlas carrying the world on their shoulders. Men were climbing, they were not firing, they were just moving slowly, like a tired pack train at the end of the day, going the other way from home. Meanwhile, the destroyers had run in almost to the beach and were blowing every pillbox out of the ground with their 5-inch guns. I saw a piece of German about 3 feet long with an arm on it sail high up into the air in the fountaining of one shell burst. It reminded me of a scene in Petrushka. Anderson finally got to the beach. So did the other 23 LCVPs from the Dorothea. 6 were lost to mine obstacles or enemy fire. Hemingway concluded, "It had been a frontal assault in broad daylight against a mined beach defended by all the obstacles military ingenuity could devise. The beach had been defended as stubbornly and as intelligently as any troops could defend it. But every boat from the Dorothea had landed her troops and cargo. No boat was lost through bad seamanship. All that were lost by enemy action." We had taken the beach. Captain James Roberts, aide to General Jed, went ashore at 5 p.m. on Easy Red. As we approached, we were hit with artillery fire. Fragments were knocking us around. He remembered several people were hit, including the skipper of our LCI. He was killed. Simultaneously, we hit a sandbar and were still about 100 yards from shore. There was mass confusion and fear, and frankly, I was in a panic. It is very difficult to dig a hole in a steel deck, and there isn't much cover on an LCI. Roberts got off in chest-deep water and made his way to shore. The beach was a complete shambles. It was like an inferno. There were bodies everywhere, and some wounded being attended to. As I went by a tank, I heard people screaming for morphine. The tank was on fire, and they were burning to death. There wasn't a thing that I could do about that, and it was pretty nerve-wracking. Shells were bursting all around. Roberts got off the beach as fast as he could. His job was to move up to Es-Laurent to set up a command post. As he climbed the bluff, a sniper opened fire. The bullet went over Roberts's head. Roberts tried to fire back, but his carbine was filled with sand and seawater and would not work. So he dove into a foxhole and cleaned it. When it was working, the sniper had gone. Roberts got to the top of the bluff but could find no one from his headquarters company, nor any working radio, so he didn't have much to do. He returned to the crest of the bluff and looked back at the channel. It was just fantastic. Vessels of all kinds as far as you could see. Soon, others from his headquarters company joined him, and Roberts set up 5 core command posts north of Es-Laurent. Someone brought along long tentage. Roberts set up a pup tent for General J.R.O.'s first night ashore. When Guerreau arrived around 9 p.m., his concerns were establishing communications and the possibility of an armoured counterattack. 5 Corps had no contact with the British 50th Division on the left, nor with the US 7th Corps on the right, nor for that matter with the Rangers at Pant Duhawk. If the Germans did counterattack, 5 Corps was on its own. Roberts's concern was his general's safety. The front line was only a half-kilometre forward of Corps headquarters, which is not the way military planners like it to be. As darkness fell, Roberts broke out one of his K-rations and ate his first food of the day. Then he found a GI blanket and curled up in a ditch for the night. Around midnight, when things seemed to be fairly quiet, I remember thinking, "Man, what a day this has been. If every day is going to be as bad as this, I'll never survive the war." There was no German counterattack. RML's plans for fighting the D-Day battle were never put into motion. There were many reasons. First, German surprise was complete. The Fortitude operation had fixed German attention on the Pas-de-Calais. They were certain it would be the site of the battle, and had placed the bulk of their panzer divisions north and east of the Seine River, where they were unavailable for counterattack in Normandy. Second, German confusion was extensive. Without air reconnaissance, with Allied airborne troops dropping here, there and everywhere, with their telephone lines cut by the resistance, with their Army Corps division and some regimental commanders at the war game in Rennes, the Germans were all but blind and leaderless. The commander who was most missed was RML, who spent the day on the road driving to Lorient. Another price the Germans paid for having lost control of the air, RML dared not fly. Third, the German command structure was a disaster. Hitler's mistrust of his generals and the generals' mistrust of Hitler were worth a king's ransom to the Allies. So were Hitler's sleeping habits, as well as his Völkisch Heim ideas. The only high command officer who responded correctly to the crisis at hand was Field Marshal Rundstedt, the old man who was there for window dressing and who was so scorned by Hitler. 2 hours before the seaborne landings began, he ordered the 2 reserve panzer divisions available for counterattack in Normandy, the 12th SS Panzer and Panzer Lehr, to move immediately toward Caen. He did so on the basis of an intuitive judgment that the airborne landings were on such a large scale that they could not be a mere deception manoeuvre, as some of his staff argued, and would have to be reinforced from the sea. The only place such landings could come in Lower Normandy was on the Calvados-Cotentin coasts. He wanted armour there to meet the attack. Rundstedt's reasoning was sound, his action decisive, his orders clear, but the panzer divisions were not under his command. They were in OKW reserve. To save precious time, Rundstedt had first ordered them to move out, then requested OKW approval. OKW did not approve. At 7:30 a.m., Jodl informed Rundstedt that the 2 divisions could not be committed until Hitler gave the order, and Hitler was still sleeping. Rundstedt had to countermand the move-out order. Hitler slept until noon. The 2 panzer divisions spent the morning waiting. There was a heavy overcast. They could have moved out free from serious interference from Allied aircraft. It was 4 p.m. when Hitler at last gave his approval. By then the clouds had broken up, and Allied fighters and bombers ranged the skies over Normandy, smashing anything that moved. The panzers had to crawl into roadside woods and wait under cover for darkness before continuing their march to the sound of the guns. The news couldn't be better, Hitler said when he was first informed that D-Day was here. As long as they were in Britain, we couldn't get at them. Now we have them where we can destroy them. He had an appointment for a reception near Salzburg for the new Hungarian Prime Minister. Other guests included diplomats from Bulgaria, Romania and Hungary. They were there to be browbeaten by Hitler into doing even more for the German war economy. When he entered the reception room, his face was radiant. He exclaimed, "It's begun at last!" After the meeting, he spread a map of France and told Goering, "They are landing here and here, just where we expected them." Goering did not correct this palpable lie. Nazi propaganda minister GBL had been told of the Allied airborne landings at 4 a.m. "Thank God at last," he said. "This is the final round." GBL's and Hitler's thinking was explained by one of GBL's aides, who had pointed out in an April 10, 1944 diary entry, "The question of whether the Allied invasion in the West is coming or not dominates all political and military discussion here. Gerald is afraid that the Allies dare not make the attempt yet. If so, that would mean for us many months of endless weary waiting, which would test our strength beyond endurance. Our war potential cannot now be increased, it can only decline. Every new air raid makes the petrol position worse." It had been given to the Nazis that the Allies had been able to build their strength in England, untouchable by the Luftwaffe or the Wehrmacht. Now they had come within range of German guns, but Hitler was more eager to hit London than to fight a defensive war. He had a weapon to do it with, the V1. It had first been flown successfully on Christmas Eve, 1943. By June 1944, it was almost ready to go to work. The V1 was a jet-powered plane carrying a 1-ton warhead. It was wildly inaccurate. Of the 8,000 launched against London, only 20% even hit that huge target. But it had a range of 250 kilometres and flew at 700 kilometres per hour, too fast for Allied aircraft or anti-aircraft guns to shoot down. On the afternoon of June 6th, Hitler ordered the Vi-1 attacks on London to begin. As was so often the case, he was giving an order that could not be carried out. It took 6 days to bring the heavy steel catapult rigs from their camouflaged dumps to the Channel coast. The attack did not begin until June 12th, and when it did, it was a fiasco. Of 10 V-1S launched, 4 crashed at once, 2 vanished without a trace, 1 demolished a railway bridge in London, and 3 hit open fields. Still, the potential was there. Fortunately for the Allies, Hitler had picked the wrong target. Haphazard bombing of London could cause sleepless nights and induce terror, but it could not have a direct military effect. Had Hitler sent the V-1S against the beaches and artificial harbours of Normandy, by June 12th, jammed with men, machines and ships, the vengeance weapons, Gerrel picked the name, which was on the mark, might have made a difference. They could sate Hitler's lust for revenge, but they could not affect the war so long as they were directed against London. On D-Day, Hitler misused his sole potential strategic weapon, just as he misused his tactical counterattack force. His interference with his commanders on the scene stands in sharp contrast to Churchill and Roosevelt, who made no attempt to tell their generals and admirals what to do on D-Day, and to Eisenhower, who also left the decision-making up to his subordinates. Eisenhower was up at 7 a.m. on June 6th. His naval aide, Harry Butcher, came by his trailer to report that the airborne landings had gone in and the seaborne landings were beginning. Butcher found Eisenhower sitting up in bed, smoking a cigarette and reading a Western novel. When Butcher arrived, Eisenhower washed, shaved, and strolled over to the tent holding the SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Operations Section. He listened to an argument about when to release a communiqué stating that the Allies had a beachhead. Montgomery insisted on waiting until he was absolutely sure the Allies were going to stay ashore, but did not interfere. Eisenhower wrote a brief message to Marshall, informing the Chief of Staff that everything seemed to be going well, and adding that the British and American troops he had seen the previous day were enthusiastic, tough, and fit. The light of battle was in their eyes. Eisenhower soon grew impatient with the incessant chatter in the tent and walked over to visit Montgomery. He found the British general wearing a sweater and a grin. Montgomery was too busy to spend much time with the Supreme Commander, as he was preparing to cross the Channel the next day to set up his advance HQ. However, the two leaders did have a brief talk. Eisenhower then visited Southwick House to see Admiral Ramsay. All was well with the Navy, Butcher recorded in his diary, and its smiles were as wide as or wider than any. At noon, Eisenhower returned to the tent, where he anxiously watched the maps and listened to the disturbing news coming from Omaha. He called some selected members of the press into his canvas-roofed, pine-walled quarters and answered questions. At one point, he got up from his small table and began pacing. He looked out the door, flashed his famous grin, and announced, "The sun is shining." For the remainder of the day, he paced, his mood alternating as he received news of the situation on the British and Canadian beaches and on Omaha. After eating, he retired early to get a good night's sleep. The Supreme Commander did not give a single command on D-Day. Hitler gave 2 bad ones. As dusk descended on Omaha Beach, intermittent shellfire continued to come down. Men dug in for the night wherever they could, some in the sand, some at the seawall, some on the bluff slopes, some behind hedgerows on the plateau. There were alarms caused by over-eager troops and occasional outbursts of firing. There were no rear areas on D-Day. Still, things had quieted down considerably. Lieutenant Henry Seitler was a forward observer for the U.S. 9th Air Force. He was taking a lot of heckling and ribbing from the guys because of the failure of the Air Forces to bomb and strafe the beaches as promised. Of course I had nothing to do with it, they just wanted to needle somebody. My biggest problem was to try to stay alive. My work didn't really start until D+3, and here I'd gone in at H+2 hours on D-Day, and I had been in the thickest and hottest part of it, and I had no real work to do, no assignment, except as far as I could see, to stay alive because I had no replacement. Late in the afternoon, Seitler and some members of a beach brigade decided they were hungry, so they went out and climbed on a burned-out LCI, landing craft infantry. They broke into the pantry and found it hadn't been damaged. They brought a lot of stuff out and ate it on the beach under the seawall. The Navy really lived fine. We had boned chicken, boned turkey, boned ham. We had everything you could think of. We made pigs out of ourselves because we were half-starved by that time. When they finished, they decided they needed to top off their picnic on the beach with some coffee. They built a small fire behind the shingle seawall using wood they had scavenged from one of the blasted-out vacation homes and made Nescafé. That turned out to be a mistake. When it was full dark, the rule was that every man should stay in his foxhole. Anything that moved would be shot. But the Nescafé had a diuretic effect on Seitler, so it was quite a problem. I'll tell you, if I made any noise or anything, I could very well get shot. All I could do was get up, ease up on the edge of my foxhole, roll over a couple of times, use an old tin can to do my business, throw it away, and roll back very slowly and quietly. I called it suffering for sanitation. I have never been able to drink Nescafé since. The next morning, Private Robert Healy of the 149th Combat Engineers and a friend decided to go down the bluff to retrieve their packs. Healy had run out of cigarettes, but he had a carton in a waterproof bag in his pack. When they walked down to the beach, it was an unbelievable sight. There was debris everywhere and all kinds of equipment washing back and forth in the tide. Anything you could think of seemed to be there. They came across a tennis racket, a guitar, assault jackets, packs, gas masks, and everything else. They found half a jar of olives, which they ate with great relish. They found Healy's pack, but unfortunately the cigarettes were no longer there. On the way back, Healy came across what was probably the most poignant memory he had of this whole episode. Lying on the beach was a young soldier, his arms outstretched. Near one of his hands was a pocketbook, what today would be called a paperback. It was Our Hearts Were Young and Gay by Cornelia Otis Skinner. This expressed the spirit of their ordeal. Our hearts were young and gay because we thought we were immortal. We believed we were doing a great thing, and we really believed in the crusade, which we hoped would liberate the world from the heel of Nazism. At 7 a.m. Mountain Wartime, 3 teenage cowboys from western Montana strode into the Mecca Cafe in Helena, the state capital. The previous afternoon, the cowboys had joined the Navy at the Helena recruiting station. They were full of bluff and bluster and themselves. Food service attention, they shouted at the waitress. She and the customers realized that the boys would be shipping out in a few hours, almost certainly their first trip out of Montana. The boisterous bad behavior of the sailors was forgiven. The waitress gave them super deluxe treatment while around the tables. The customers resumed their conversations over the coffee cups. Someone switched on the radio. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force has just announced that the invasion has begun. Repeat, D-Day has come. A reporter for the Helena Independent Record was in the cafe. He wrote that the news was first met with unbelief and then rapt silence. Food was forgotten. Not a single voice was raised in request for service. No one wanted anything. They only sat and listened and wondered. Not until the invention of the telegraph did people on the varied home fronts of wars know that a great battle was underway, even as it was being fought. For Americans in 1861–65, the first news came from bulletins in the newspapers that said little more than that a great battle was being fought in Pennsylvania or Mississippi. Over the next few days, the papers would report on the battle, and then would come the seemingly never-ending lists of the dead. Gettysburg and Vicksburg were fought simultaneously, which meant that in the first days of July 1863, virtually every American knew someone who was in one of the battles: son, husband, father, mother, brother, sister, grandchild, girlfriend, uncle, or friend. They all had to hold their breath, wait, pray, worry, pray some more, and wait some more. In World War I, Americans again had such agonizing experiences. By World War II, wire transmission had improved. Americans whose loved ones were in the Pacific, North Africa, or Italy heard radio reports of battles as they happened, and within a week or so could see carefully censored moving picture film from the battle, never showing dead or badly wounded Americans. What they could not know was how their loved one had fared. For that, they could only wait and pray that the man from Western Union did not knock at their door. On D-Day, a vast majority of the American people was involved. Most of them had made a direct contribution as farmers providing the food, as workers in defense plants making planes or tanks or shells or rifles or boots or any of the myriad items the troops needed to win the war, or as volunteers doing the work at hundreds of agencies. The bandages they had rolled, the rifles they had made were being put to use even as they heard the news. They prayed that they had done it right. Andrew Jackson Higgins caught the spirit well. He was in Chicago on D-Day and sent a message to his employees in New Orleans. "This is the day for which we have been waiting. Now the work of our hands, our hearts, and our heads is being put to the test. The war bonds you have bought, the blood you donated, are also in their fighting. We may all be inspired by the news that the first landings on the continent were made by the Allies in our boats. The workers at Higgins Industries and the workers in defense plants around the nation had sacrificed their daily routines to make the invasion possible. They had jobs, which was a blessing to a generation that had just gone through the Depression, and they were well paid, although nobody got rich on an hourly wage. But they sacrificed to do it. Polly Crow worked the night shift at the Jefferson Boat Company outside Louisville, Kentucky. She helped make LSTs, landing ship tanks. She wrote her husband, who was in the army, about their savings, something young couples in the Depression could only dream about. "We now have $1,780 in the bank and 5 bonds, which looks good to me. As soon as I get the buggy in good shape, I can really pile it in to make that money." Mrs. Crow worked a 10-hour night shift, cared for her 2-year-old son during the day, and had her mother look after the child at night. She did volunteer work at the Red Cross and shared her apartment with another woman and her mother. There were tens of thousands of young women like Mrs. Crow. Quick marriages had become the norm, 1 million more during the war than would have been expected at pre-war rates. Teenagers got married because the boy was going off to war, and in many cases, in the moral atmosphere of the day, if they wanted to have a sexual experience before he left, they had to stand in front of a preacher first. When the boy husbands left for war to become men, the girl wives became women. They travelled alone or with their infants to distant places on hot and stuffy or cold and overcrowded trains, became proficient cooks and housekeepers, managed the finances, learned to fix the car, worked in a defence plant, and wrote letters to their soldier husbands that were consistently upbeat. "I write his dad everything our baby does," one young mother explained. "Only in the letters I make it sound cute." Women in uniform were a new phenomenon for Americans of the 1940s. They were in every branch of service, but were more strictly segregated by their sex than blacks were by their race. The names of those segregated organizations were condescending: Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAC, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF, Women's Auxiliary Ferry Squadron, WAAFs, and WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. In late 1944, the Navy dropped the acronym, and the women were called Women Reserves. The women in uniform did everything the men did except engage in combat. They were clerks, mechanics, administrators, radio operators, photo interpreters, cooks, meteorologists, supply sergeants, test pilots, transport pilots, and much more. Eisenhower felt he could not have won the war without them. They did not have an easy time. Cruel and vicious jokes were told about them, although not by the wounded, about the nurses. These pioneering women persevered and triumphed. The contribution of the women of America, whether on the farm, in the factory, or in uniform, to D-Day, was a sine qua non of the invasion effort. D-Day, for the young women who had husbands they hardly knew stationed in the ETO, European Theatre of Operations, was an especially trying experience. But then, few Americans were without personal worries. Nearly every American knew someone in the Army, Army Air Force, Navy or Coast Guard stationed in the European theatre. Only a handful knew if the soldier, sailor or airman was in action on D-Day or if he was going in later, but they all knew that before the War was one their loved ones would be in a combat zone. Now it had started. The build-up phase was over. The United States was committed to throwing into the battle all the vast forces she had brought into existence over the past 3 years. That meant their boy, brother, husband, boyfriend, employee, fellow student, cousin, or nephew was either already in combat or soon would be. In Helena and New York, throughout the nation, people sat and wondered. They listened to the radio and dashed out on the streets for the latest edition of the newspaper, which featured a front-page map of the French coast. The home front heard and read about World War II. On D-Day, what Americans heard and read was dismayingly lacking in details. The official Nazi news agency, Transocean, was the first to announce the invasion. The Associated Press picked it up and put it on the wire. The New York Times had it on the streets at 1:30 a.m., but it was just a headline, no story. At 2 a.m. Eastern Wartime, the networks interrupted their musical programs with a flash announcement. German radio said the invasion had begun. The Germans reported a naval battle off Le Havre and airborne landings north of the Seine. These were the dummy parachutists. Commentators quickly pointed out that there was no confirmation from Allied sources, and warned that it might well be a trick designed to get the resistance in France to rise up prematurely, thus exposing the organisation to destruction. At 9:32 a.m. in London, a brief communiqué from General Eisenhower was released by his press aide, Colonel Ernest Dupe. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The communiqué was also sent by radio to New York, featuring a recording of Eisenhower reading his order of the day. It was a marvelous reading, rich in tone and resonant, and it provided a unifying experience since it had been broadcast over the loudspeakers on the LSTs and transports in the southern England harbours before D-Day. Thus, the American people heard what the invading force had heard. By 4:15 a.m. Eastern Wartime, NBC had an eyewitness report from London by a reporter who had flown with the 1001 Airborne. Throughout the morning, more eyewitness reports came from reporters who had been at sea and returned to London. They had seen a lot of smoke, ships and planes, but little else. There was nothing from the beaches. People listened to each new announcement breathlessly, only to be disappointed. Eustace Tilley, pseudonymous talk of the town correspondent for the New Yorker, found it maddening. The idiotic babble of the radio followed them wherever they went. The incoming news was so slow that there were long periods, hours and more, when nothing new came over the wire. Yet the tension was so great that people wanted to hear something, so the broadcasters kept repeating themselves and quoting each other. The commentators had a terrible time with French place names. They needed some geography lessons. Their attempts at military analysis ranged from misleading to silly. They chattered away with little to say, except that it was on. They talked about everything except the one thing that was uppermost in the minds of many in the audience, casualties. This was forbidden by the Office of War Information, OWI. Radio's shortcomings were caused primarily by OWI, but the censorship policies contributed. OWI refused to give out the information the American people most longed to hear, what divisions, regiments, squadrons or ships were involved. The site of the landings was only described as being on the French coast. The reason for this strict censorship was to keep the Fortitude operation alive. The price in the United States was heightened anxiety. Radio could not provide information, but it could provide inspiration. After the recording of Eisenhower's reading of his order of the day, the King of Norway spoke to his people, followed by the premiers of the Netherlands and Belgium, then the King of England. All these were repeated throughout the day. Thin as the news was on the radio, it was a comfort. A California woman wrote to Paul White, a CBS announcer, "It is 3:21 a.m. here on the Pacific coast. I was fortunate enough to hear the first radio news of D-Day break from CBS this morning. As I have spent all my evenings waiting at the radio these past 2 months, your London report from Mr. Marrow gave me a feeling that, though I'm at least one world's distance from my husband and alone, I will not feel that way as long as you and your staff keep on the job." On D-Day, Franklin Roosevelt used the power of radio to link the nation in a prayer. Throughout the day, the networks broadcast the text, which was printed in the afternoon editions of the newspapers. At 10 p.m. Eastern Wartime, the President prayed while Americans across the country joined him. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavour. Lead them straight and true, give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. These men are lately drawn from the ways of peace. They fight not for the lust of conquest, but to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They yearn but for the end of battle, for their return to the haven of home. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. And, O Lord, give us faith. Give us faith in thee, faith in our sons, faith in each other. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen. What does the D stand for? A passerby asked Eustace Tilley. Why, it just stands for day, the New Yorker correspondent rightly answered. Writing about the incident, he went on, D-Day was a unique experience, a colossal moment in history. His stroll about town took him to Times Square, where a crowd watched the electric news bulletin, which read, "One German gun is still firing." Nobody seemed to think that the one German gun was trivial. It was solemnly weighed along with the other bits of news from the beachheads. A reporter for the New York Times noted that people stood on the sidewalk near the curb or against the plate glass windows of shops and restaurants on all sides of the little triangle, looking up, always looking up, to catch even a glimpse of the invasion news. Tilley joined 100 or so citizens outside the Rialto Theatre. Men were clustered together, talking about the course of history during the past 25 years. Everybody waited their turn and made their points without raising their voices more than necessary. The sober talk was still going on when he left. He went to one of the network broadcasting studios and found the corridors full of radio actors, all somewhat upset by the cancellation of the soap opera programs. Over the radio, he heard once again the Eisenhower recording. General Eisenhower's words are tied up with the image of D-Day that we think will remain in our minds the longest. Up in the Modern Museum, an old lady seated on an angular plywood chair was reading the general message aloud to several other old ladies who stood clustered around her. "I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us," she read in a thin voice, and a shiver ran through the group. New York City on June 6, 1944, was a bustling, prosperous place. Everyone had jobs and more cash than there were products to buy. Apartments were hard, if not impossible, to find. People doubled and tripled up. Bars and movie theaters were jammed. The spring season on Broadway was a big success, topped by Oklahoma, by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, Paul Robeson in All, Milton Berle in Ziegfeld Follies, and Mary Martin in One Touch of Venus, with music by Kurt Weill, book by S.J. Perelman and Ogden Nash, staged by Elia Kazan, with dances by Agnes de Mille. Those were the days Broadway shut down on D-Day. The actors went to the stage door canteen to perform a scene or two from their plays for servicemen only. Only one table, the Angels' Table, was available to non-service men. It was reserved for civilians whose mildly royal donations won them the privilege of admission to the canteen. The donations went to servicemen's organizations. The New York Daily News threw out its lead articles and printed in their place the Lord's Prayer. The New York Daily Mirror eliminated all advertising from its columns to make room for invasion news. Stores shut down. Macy's closed at noon, but there was a large crowd around it because the store set up a loudspeaker that carried radio programs. When one announcer read a dispatch warning Americans against rejoicing, a reporter for the New York Times noted that the faces of those who stood listening were grim and subdued. Lord and Taylor never opened at all. President Walter Hoving said he was sending his 3,000 employees home to pray. "The store is closed," he announced. "The invasion has begun. Our only thought can be of the men who are fighting in it. We have closed our doors because we know our employees and customers who have loved ones in battle will want to give this day to hopes and prayers for their safety." Baseball games and racing programs were cancelled. In his column Sports of the Times, Arthur Daly raised the question of whether all sports events should be cancelled until the war was won. He decided that, once the stunning impact of the invasion news had worn off, there would not be the same irresistible urge to glue one's ear to the radio for last-minute bulletins. Human nature would again demand entertainment as a distraction from the war. Movies, theatre, and all other diversions, including sports, would resume. Daly said no one resented the youths playing games while others died, because everyone knew that the baseball players were either 4F or too old. The entire Yankee starting lineup of 1941, he reminded readers, was in uniform. Military, not baseball, but as bad as the replacements were, Daly wanted the season to struggle along as best it could. After all, it was still part of our American way of life, and that is one of the things we are fighting for. Wall Street went about its business. The New York Stock Exchange called for 2 minutes of silent prayer at the opening, then went to work. The headline in the June 7th edition of the Wall Street Journal read, "Invasion's impact marks beginning of end-of-war economy, new problems for industry." The market had suffered a case of invasion jitters for 2 months. According to Time magazine, the New York Stock Exchange had quivered on every D-Day rumour. But on D-Day, taking its courage firmly in hand, the exchange had its busiest day of the year, turning over 1,193,000 shares. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose to 142.24, a new peak for 1944. Stocks of companies like A.T. Chrysler, Westinghouse, General Motors, DuPont, and retail stores all hit new highs for 1944. As always, Wall Street was concerned with the future. As the Journal put it, the invasion had raised the curtain on reconversion. As soon as it was clear that the invasion had succeeded, a limited reconversion to civilian production would be possible. Contract cancellations would increase, freeing manpower, materials, and facilities for a small-scale start on production of new consumer goods. Assuming all went as planned, that time was thought to be 2 to 4 months off. In December 1944, the GIs paid for this unrealistic optimism. Orders for artillery shells were cut back during the summer. When the great German counter-offensive in Belgium began, American batteries were always short of, and some ran out of ammunition. The New York Times financial section gave a patriotic cast to its report on Wall Street's day. The stock market gave a salute of confidence to the Allied invasion forces in a buying splurge. The motor issues continued to attract the greatest attention. While other industrials with high post-war ratings shared in the advance, which found support from all sections of the nation, New Yorkers, more concerned with the present than the future, came in large numbers to the Civilian Defense Volunteer Office on Fifth Avenue. They signed up for various tasks: bandage rolling, administering vision tests, checking prices for the Office of Price Administration, nursing aides, daycare aides at the Red Cross, and other servicemen centres. The USO and dozens of other organisations saw volunteers performing numerous jobs across the city. Record numbers of people gave blood. At 3:40 a.m., Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia spoke to reporters at Gracie Mansion, stating, "We can only wait for bulletins and pray for success. It is the most exciting moment in our lives." The editors of the New York Times tried to put some perspective on D-Day in their lead editorial for the June 7th edition. They wrote, "We have come to the hour for which we were born. We go forth to meet the supreme test of our arms and of our souls, the test of the maturity of our faith in ourselves and in mankind. We pray for the boys we know and for millions of unknown boys who are equally a part of us. We pray for our country. The cause prays for itself, for it is the cause of the God who created man free and equal." North of New York City, it was graduation day at West Point. Among the graduates was Cadet John Eisenhower, and among the families gathered was Mrs. Dwight D. Eisenhower. On June 3rd, from Portsmouth, General Eisenhower had written to Mrs. Eisenhower, "This note will probably reach you soon after you return to Washington from West Point. There's nothing I would not have given to have been with you and John on June 6th, but I'm so deep in work that I'll actually be lucky to remember the exact date. Anyway, I hope you and he had a nice time with the family. I send you much love with this note, as time has not permitted letter writing recently, and probably will not for a while, but I know you understand. Eisenhower mixed the dates, remembering that John had graduated on D-Day, which had been scheduled for June 5th. Mrs. Eisenhower found out about D-Day from a New York Post reporter who woke her with a telephone call to her room at the hotel there at West Point. "The invasion!" Mrs. Eisenhower exclaimed. "What about the invasion?" On June 9th, General Eisenhower sent a telegram to Mrs. Eisenhower, stating, "Due to previous plans, it was impossible for me to be with you and John on Monday. But I thought of you and hope you and he had a nice time with the family. I send you much love with this note, as time has not permitted letter writing recently, and probably will not for a while, but I know you understand." Monday was June 5th. Evidently, Eisenhower remembered that John had graduated on D-Day and mixed the dates. In New York and throughout the land, bells tolled. The greatest of these was the Liberty Bell, which had last been tolled on July 8, 1835, for the funeral of Chief Justice John Marshall. At 7 a.m. on D-Day, Philadelphia Mayor Bernard Samuel tapped the bell with a wooden mallet, sending its voice throughout the country over a radio network. He then offered a prayer. The impulse to pray was overwhelming. Many people got their first word of the invasion as they began their daily routines. After recovering their breath, they said a silent prayer. Others heard the news broadcast on loudspeakers during their night shifts on assembly lines around the country. Men and women paused over their machines, prayed, and returned to work with renewed dedication. Across the United States and Canada, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the Gulf Coast, church bells rang, not in triumph or celebration, but as a solemn reminder of national unity and a call to formal prayer. Special services were held in every church and synagogue. Pews were jammed with worshippers. In Washington, General Pershing issued a statement. The commander of the World War I AEF said, 26 years ago, American soldiers, in cooperation with their allies, were locked in mortal combat with the German enemy. Today, the sons of American soldiers of 1917 to 18 are engaged in a like war of liberation. It is their task to bring freedom to peoples who have been enslaved. I have every confidence that they, together with their gallant brothers in arms, will win through to victory. At the Capitol building, politicians went about their business on D-Day. The House voted 305 to 35 to proceed with the court-martial of Major General Walter Short and Rear Admiral Husband Kimmel in order to fix responsibility for the Pearl Harbor disaster. "It's all politics," one congressman confessed. The Democrats, who opposed but felt they could not vote against the resolution, which they had been delaying for 2 years, charged that the Republicans were seeking to make a campaign issue in an effort to embarrass President Roosevelt. The Republicans who sponsored the resolution and were unanimous for it charged that the Democrats were trying to delay any possible disclosures until after the presidential election. Both charges were true. In mid-afternoon, Roosevelt held a press conference. Over 180 reporters filled the executive office almost to capacity. According to the New York Times reporter, they found Mr. Roosevelt looking tired around the eyes, but smiling. He sat at his desk in shirt sleeves, wearing a dark bow tie. He smoked a cigarette stuck into a yellow-amber holder. "How do you feel about the progress of the invasion?" a reporter asked. "It's up to schedule," the president replied, then smiled. He went on to say he had reports from General Eisenhower indicating that only 2 destroyers and 1 LST had been sunk, and that losses among the flyers were less than 1%. General Eisenhower alone decided the actual date and place. Stalin had known of the plan since the Tehran meeting and was pleased with it. A second front a year ago would have been impossible due to lack of men and equipment. The war was not over by any means. This operation was not even over, and this was no time for overconfidence. After the conference, Roosevelt conferred with Admiral Ernest J. King and General Marshall. At their rarefied level, so far removed from the battle, they couldn't tell the president much more than what was coming over the radio. Marshall was stopped as he left the Oval Office by a reporter who asked if he had spent the night at his desk. "No," Marshall replied, then smiled a little bit and said simply, "I had done my work before." In Bedford, Virginia, the local newspaper, The Bulletin, printed a prayer written by Mrs. H.M. Lane of nearby Alavista. "Dear Father and great Maker of all things, beauty that dies the soonest lives the longest. Who can fail to see the beauty in the sacrifice our brave lads are making because they cannot keep themselves for a day, will keep them forever in memory and give them immortality." A reporter for the Bulletin wrote that news of the invasion brought a feeling of uneasiness to hundreds of Bedford County homes. Many of them had sons, husbands, and brothers in the army in England. Old Company A of the 116th Regiment had been in training there for nearly 2 years, and was probably among the first landing forces. Hundreds of other Bedford County men would ultimately be thrown into the fight, and among them some casualties were expected. He noted that every church in town was filled to capacity for special services. A month later, on July 6th, the Bulletin reported that Old Company A had received high praise for its role in D-Day, and went on to say, "So far there have been no reports of fatalities, but as yet the government has given out no complete list of casualties. There has been considerable uneasiness about the fate of the men, as it seemed too much to hope that all of them could have come safely through the landing ordeal and subsequent fighting." In the July 20th issue, the Bulletin reported that the 116th had been awarded a presidential citation and recorded the awful news that on July 19th, 14 families in Bedford were informed that their sons had been killed on June 6th. There would be more to come, the editor wrote. They died as all free men should die, gallantly and unafraid. They knew what was before them, but there was no shirking or hesitation, no holding back, no attempt to escape. At the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial overlooking Omaha Beach, there are 11 sons of Bedford buried along with 9,386 other American war dead from the Normandy campaign. The cemetery is beautifully and perfectly maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. No American can visit the site without feeling a surge of pride, nor can any American suppress a flow of tears. In the circular chapel there are inscribed these words, "Think not only upon their passing, remember the glory of their spirit." The historic St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans, from the first early Mass until benediction Tuesday night, was full. A mother of a paratrooper, her only child, prayed by the side of a policeman with 2 boys over there. A pretty young bride knelt before a statue of Our Lady of Prompt Succor, while in a nearby pew a sailor home on leave prayed. Canal Street store owners had planned for D-Day for 3 months. When it came, they turned their employees to selling war bonds rather than goods. The idea was picked up in a number of other cities. On Canal Street, patriotic music and appeals to buy bonds filled the air. Bonds went at a record pace. One woman counted out $18.75 in dimes for a bond, explaining, "I've been saving this money to buy a bond on the day of invasion. I hope it will be a day I can remember happily. My husband is with the airborne troops, and he's been in England for a long time waiting for this." There were record crowds at the Red Cross Blood Donor Centre on Canal Street, and record numbers of volunteers at various civilian agencies. But in a city that seizes on any excuse for a parade, there was no parade. The Times-Picayune explained that New Orleans was hoarding its parades for V-Day. Andrew Higgins reminded his employees that there was a long way to go, not just in Europe. "There should not be let up on our part until our boats have carried our troops onto the shores of Japan." In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mackenzie King reported to the House of Commons that the landings were making good progress, but warned that there was still much to do. Opposition leader Gordon Graydon said there were no divisions of opinion on this day. From the ranks of the French-speaking members, Maurice Duplessis rose to acclaim in French the historic fact that, "From the echelons of time has rung out the hour of the deliverance of France, on D-Day Canada, like the United States."